Thank you for the invitation to be here this evening and for the warmth of the welcome. I'm rather an enthusiast for art films. Sorry? Functioning? And I want to begin by referring to one of the less well-known of Bogart's films, which is Key Largo. I hope some of you have seen it. It includes a wonderful episode involving Edward G. Robinson playing a gangster called Johnny Rocco, as only Edward G. Robinson could. At one point, he gets involved in a discussion with Bogart, who says, "What does Johnny Rocco want?" And there's a long pause. And Bogart says, "I'll tell you what Johnny Rocco wants. He wants more." Edward G. Robinson reflects on this for a moment and says, "Yeah, that's right. Johnny Rocco wants more." And that, alas, sometimes feels like the default setting when we talk about growth. The last few years, however, have focused our attention as never before on the question of what we want growth for. If we want more, what exactly do we want more of, and why? The fact that you've set up this discussion, as you've just described it, in terms of connecting the life of the businesses of this area with the well-being of the community is crucial here. And what I want to talk about for a few minutes is that overlap between wealth and well-being as a way into thinking about the notion of growth. It does seem to me that if we try to discuss issues of growth and rising prosperity without some such robust and clear sense of well-being, we shall end up in a very strange and not very constructive place. So I'd like to begin with setting out one of the paradoxes of wealth. It seems to me that one of the things we want wealth for is obviously security. We want to know that we're not living at risk, that ourselves and our families have a future that has some stability to it. We're in an environment that has some consistency and reliability. But, and here's the thing we don't always register, that stability is what allows us to take the risks we need to take, to change, to push the envelope, not just to stand still. We need stability so that we can take risks. We need to feel secure so that we're able to do things that are a bit insecure. If everything is about security, nothing changes. If everything is about risk, everyone feels anxious. So well-being, it seems, includes trying to find that very elusive point of balance where we have enough sense of security to enable us to move out and to do new things. Enough sense that we're a dependable environment, an environment that won't let us down, to let our imaginations run a bit. And that, as I say, is quite an elusive point to get to. And one of the problems of the last few years and the economic crisis we've been living through is that it's temptingly easy to react away from a context that doesn't feel at all reliable for a lot of people, and to batten down the hatches, and to say this is no time to take risks, this is no time to move out of our comfort zone. But well-being includes that capacity for imagining and pushing the boundaries just as much as the need for a dependable environment where we feel we're not going to be let down. And actually, when you think this through, it's not really rocket science, is it? In our personal relationships, we desperately need security. We need the assurance that we're not going to be let down. And we need that not so that we can simply snuggle under the duvet, but in order to create new relationships for ourselves, in order to shape the world and ourselves a little bit more. Well-being is about satisfying human relationships, undoubtedly. And at the same time, it's about that appropriate level of freedom in respect of our environment and our possibilities that gives us the satisfaction of being creative. And I suppose, if I can be theological just for a moment, that's the particular point of balance that a theologian from the Jewish or Christian tradition would want to see as involved in our very place in creation. We are given an unbreakable relationship with our Creator, not so that we may snuggle under the duvet of our experience, but so that we may be creators in a secondary way along with our Creator. That is part of our being. Satisfying human relationships, freedom from stress, the anxiety of instability, access to what enlarges or enriches us. All of those are involved in our well-being. All of those are therefore part of what our wealth is for, in the profoundest sense. So I welcome the emphasis which this consortium has identified, asking local businesses to ask themselves, in what sense are they creating and shaping a stable, a reliable environment so that people feel free to make a difference and to take risks? Easily said, but of course we are still in an overall social and economic environment where stability just is not the first thing that comes to mind, is it? And there's a limit to what even the best intentioned business can achieve in that context. Nonetheless, these surely have to be the questions that must be asked, and asked consistently, and asked intelligently. And to go on pressing those questions is to recognize, of course, that the activity of business is something inescapable in human life, one of those forms of cooperation that we most regularly involve ourselves in. And that therefore, the life of business enterprise is properly part of a whole interlocking picture of how human beings shape, influence, and even serve one another. The religious viewpoint from which I come and from which I speak is one which lays very, very heavy emphasis on interdependence, and therefore one in which wealth always has to be conceived in terms of what it makes possible for other people, not just for myself. Again, for the well-being that we share, the well-being of functioning relationships that allow us to move out, to grow as persons, not just as economic units, to take the risks that will open up fresh possibilities for others. And this takes me back to thinking a bit about the oddity of the last few years in the financial and economic world. Oddity, because it seems to me that part of what has got us into the economic mess we're in at the moment, internationally, is a breakdown of some of the deepest values of business itself. One could say a lot about those virtues, but let me just focus on two things in particular, which seem to me to be crucial in the life of well-functioning business, and if I'm wrong, you'll put me right in short order, I'm sure. The first of those virtues is the very obvious one of trust. Well-functioning business depends on the cultivation of trust. Not just in structure, but once again in relationship. It depends on the capacity to consolidate, to reinforce people's sense of their own worth by recognizing that others are dependent on them for their honesty and their integrity. Business has always relied on that. And I can remember vividly, shortly after the first dramatic days of the crash in 2008, a very, very senior executive in a very, very prominent concern in the City of London saying to me glumly over breakfast, "We have, of course, completely forgotten the priority of trust in the way we've conducted our affairs. We have made ourselves untrustworthy." And the second traditional value of the business world is a long-term perspective. Modern business, as it develops in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance period, is about deep breaths and long views. The creation of limited liability companies precisely so that you're not dependent on instant returns and predictable outcomes, so that you can think a bit beyond the comfort zone, so that you have just enough to keep you going beyond what's obvious. And that, of course, is precisely what trust makes possible and encourages. When you have trustful relations, you have the possibility of a longer view. You don't measure people by what they deliver tomorrow or the day after. You have the freedom to look more broadly. And the whole development of early capitalism, as far as I can see, is about the weaving together of those two themes, trust and the long-term view, which consolidate that blend of stable, dependable environment and creative risk-taking, so that well-being is maximized. And over these last few years, we've become bitterly conscious that just as trust has been undermined by some financial practices, so has the long-term view. A couple of days ago, I was at a meeting in the premises of a city firm. It was a meeting of a little group working on some fundraising for a project connected with my college. As we went up from the first floor to the seventh in the lift, one of my colleagues rather wryly remarked that the sum we were hoping to raise for our college project over the next few years was probably a sum that had already been added to the corporate wealth of the concern whose guests we were in the time it took for us to get from the first to the seventh floor. That may be an exaggeration, though I doubt it. But it does seem to me that the feverish atmosphere of financial markets in the last few years has done quite a lot to weaken that historic, traditional sense that the long-term view, patience about outcomes, is one of the proper virtues that business practice teaches us. And the work of some people like Michael Sandel in the United States and Richard Sennett in the United Kingdom has also brought to light more and more clearly over the last few years the impact that this has on our very sense of what it's like to be human. It's increasingly foregrounded a style of human life and human relationship that is anxious, feverish, desperate to nail down results almost before you can't even say the ink is dry now, but before your fingers are off the key. So, if we're talking about wealth, well-being, and the virtues of business, we need to frame that within a sense of what kind of life is good for human beings. And I believe within a conviction that kind of life is one capable of patience, capable of the long-term view, capable, therefore, of exactly that space for imagining, risking, innovating that can only come when you have a sense of fundamental security and trustworthiness around you. There's still, I think, in many quarters, a sense that we might one day soon get back to normal in the international financial world. But those who approach this with more intelligence seem less and less convinced that there's a normal to get back to. We have to do some much harder and more fundamental thinking. And thinking which has to bring in that deep question, what is this for? What is well-being like? What are good lives like? Looking around at the businesses which have been displaying their wares in this cathedral in recent days, I'm struck by the sheer variety of human well-being envisaged and imagined around here. Struck by the ways in which you could put together a sort of vision of a well-functioning human life by sampling a lot of what is going on here. And increasingly the task we have, I believe, is joining dots, putting together those facets of a well-lived life to get a slightly larger, slightly more generous picture overall of what it's like to be a human being, what the well-lived life feels like. That's a debate which, as I've said, a good many intellectuals in the States and here and indeed elsewhere are pursuing. But we have, in a network like this, a rare and welcome opportunity of carrying that forward, not at the seminar level, but at the level of intense, lucid, courageous and challenging discussion among practitioners who know something of their responsibility to the community, who know something of the possibilities and the challenges. That's why it is such a great pleasure to be part of this conversation tonight. And that's why I hope very deeply that we can get a little bit beyond what I defined at the beginning as the Johnny Rocco philosophy. It won't do just to say, we want more. It won't do just to say, it's all about growth. We need to think through what sustainable growth, humane growth, creative growth is like. And if we're going to do that, then our talking about wealth has constantly to spill over into our talking about well-being in that broad sense that I've tried to outline. And above all, it will try all the time to find that elusive point of balance between the stable environment that is stable enough for us to want to take risks, that dependence which gives us the capacity to be more independent, that sense that we can trust people around us so much that we can afford to surprise them. And I would say that that is a picture of human life, human maturity, and human balance with some very deep religious roots, as well as the obvious pragmatic ones. I hope that will be indeed some of the burden of conversation this evening and the conversations that will flow from this event and others like it. Thank you very much indeed.